For the PressCorps, I'm Jeffrey Jennings, and today I'm humbled to be hosting a Foxhole Logistics Players Roundtable. A week ago, I was approached by a player named General Retreat who suggested this roundtable to me as strong concerns about Foxhole's logistics experience have come to a head among the logistics player base. I'm joined by 3 Warden and 3 Colonial players from the Logistics Organization for General Improvements, also known as L.O.G.I, also known as the Logistics Union or L.O.G.I Union, and the Logistics Lobbyists. Those players are from Callahan's Infrastructure and Logistics or CIL Wuatduhf, from the Three Crowns or T-3C MOV Hannibal, from Flanks Manufacturing and Transport or FMAT General Retreat, from the Swords of Morrow or SOM Knight of Britonnia, non-regimented player Bazlow, and also from T-3C as well as Landing Ship or LS Alabastor. These players were chosen by a public vote in the L.O.G.I Discord, and they've come together here to put their grievances into a public letter to Foxhole's developers, which we will reference, as well as spoken word. The open letter can be accessed at logiunion.com in various translations and languages. But first we'll begin by letting General Retreat do a brief rundown of the L.O.G.I Union and the steps we have taken to get here at this very moment. So, General?
Hi. It's quite surreal being here to do this as well. But happy to give a quick history of everything that's happened so far. Emphasis on quick. So originally, the server, which has now become L.O.G.I, was known as the L.O.G.I Lobbyists Lounge, and this came to be in October. And the idea was starting this kind of conversation, so Roundtable to publicly air a kind of bipartisan group of players' feelings about the current state of L.O.G.I, and this was something that had been brewing for quite a long time. I think there has been generally quite a lot of discontent about the state of logistics for a while, and that was only exacerbated when the map expanded and travel times got so much longer. So that these kind of conversations have been happening for a little while. So initially what happened is there was a group of logistics clan leaders, so like FMAT, T3C, SIL, various others, who all got together to kind of discuss these issues and say, where are the common pain points for L.O.G.I across both factions? How can we communicate these issues? How can we try and drive towards some kind of positive improvement to the systems? Because ultimately, even though we have concerns about the system, we all love L.O.G.I as a whole, and we think that Foxhole is a really promising game, which we want to contribute to making better. So that was how the discussion started, and as time went on, the factions involved added more and more people to contribute to the discussion, and it was really when the experimental changes in Dev Branch were announced that things came to a head. So there were various changes that caused quite a lot of backlash. So there were the changes to pallets and trenches, etc. And the result of that was, as I said, backlash. You could see that all across the subreddit. There was a lot of discussion in the various faction discords on the official Foxhole Discord as well. And the invite link to the L.O.G.I Lobbyist Lounge was shared on Reddit. And it was at that point that the movement started to grow explosively. And I'll say that much. Just for context, I'd taken a quick break from the game and Discord for a week. When I came back, I had something like 80 notifications, and the Discord had grown from 30 odd people to, I would say, 60. And I was thinking, what on earth is going on? Like, there is a lot of productive discussion that's happening. This is really good to see. And then it just kept growing. So by the end of that day, we were up to 100 people, and then it was 300 people, and then a couple of days later, it was 600 people. And ever since then, we've basically been riding the tiger, just holding on for dear life and trying to capitalize on the strong feelings that so much of the community have and drive it towards something productive. So something that's been really important to L.O.G.I from the very beginning is trying to make sure that there is as much input and participation by the L.O.G.I community on both factions to make sure that issues are well represented. So we've been holding votes for the delegates that you will see here today. We've tried to make sure that in terms of server moderation and things like that, there's equal representation across both factions. And we've been collating a massive list of feedback where people feel so passionate about this. And there's even been a logistics survey that's been conducted that we've had over 400 responses in. So this is really something that people feel passionate about, and they're driven to try and achieve really positive engagement with the game's developers. Like no one is joining a server like L.O.G.I because they hate the game or they hate the developers. This is all about trying to improve the level of communication and engagement between the community and the developers, and secure those beneficial changes that we think will drive the game to like even better levels where players will enjoy it even more. So really, that's the sole purpose of L.O.G.I as an organisation.
I do have to say, I was worried at first when the memes started coming across the subreddit about unions and striking and stuff. I was very, very, oh no, is this going to be just a mass griefing and, people shooting at each other and a lot of bannings and whatnot. And the biggest tragedy of it all would have been no one's actually going to be talking about logistics, updates and quality of life and reform or updates and stuff. So it's I'm glad it's been phenomenal. The organization, discourse, and the positive passion I've seen in that Discord, as well as just talking with all of you gentlemen, has been absolutely great. So I can't wait for the conversation we're about to have. So you know what? We'll move on now by allowing everyone some time to talk generally about their own personal logistics burnout. So we'll start with Wuatduhf. And we'll try and keep it rather brief. I don't know if anyone brought a monologue along. If so, that's perfectly fine. But Wuatduhf, we'll start with you.
Sure. Thank you, Jeffrey. I'm glad to be here. So my story starts, I joined Foxhole back in War 61 as a purely solo person, and didn't really expect to really get into things until I just happened to get into a small group of friends. Basically played as a squad of people for a couple wars after that, but didn't really take long before some of them had to stop, just due to not really doing L.O.G.I as much or having to deal with IRL, as most groups end up doing. Eventually made my way up to regiments and worked with a few groups until eventually working with my own L.O.G.I regiment, CIL, where I'm currently at now. And so my path has always been dealing with the gameplay of logistics, which is always fun. I enjoy that kind of logistics grind. It's just that sometimes you end up having to deal with certain systems that we'll talk about, where it feels like it's good, but there's just something nagging on you with every little piece. Like maybe you're having to stick around with factories because you need to collect your orders, or you got to balance between multiple different stockpiles. And I think we'll hit on a lot of that here, like all these individual issues that we've come across.
We'll actually skip General because he talked earlier. We'll have him go last. So we'll move on to Knight of Britonnia.
Hello, Jeffrey. Very happy to be here. Very honored to be amongst all of these very experienced logistics players that are here with me today. My story kind of begins about War 80, War 81-ish, so I'm not as much of a veteran as just some of these lads that are here with me today, but at the same time, I would classify myself as a support role sort of player. I'm always willing to kind of flex and go wherever I'm needed, be that running supplies to the front, or helping with artillery tanks. Wherever I'm needed, I'm happy to go. And you'll find there's a lot of people in the Union who are like that. We're all support players that want to support and help our faction. And from my early days of playing the game, logistics was always something that was kind of a scary beast to get into, because there was just a lot of different systems that, either weren't consistent or didn't completely make sense, or the tutorial didn't teach over. And eventually, over various wars, I've become more and more engaged with the logistics systems. Specifically in Somme, we might not be a logistics regiment, but our logistics cohort, as it were, is very big, and also very much a well-tuned machine, and getting to work with them and experience logistics with them and grow with them has been a great pleasure. Specifically, what brought me to the Union, though, is this community that we've really kind of fostered quite rapidly, of solidarity and being able to leave our faction colors at the door and come together to discuss logistics and how it can be improved and made better. Because a lot of us do enjoy logistics, but there's just a lot of little things that slowly pick up and kind of grind you down over time into this sort of that takes you down the path of burnout. And I've seen some very good and skilled logistics players that have gone down this path and have noticed this sort of grinding as well myself. And I haven't been around nearly as long as some of these players, but you start to feel after a while, the more and more engaged you get. And logistics is a fun and satisfying way to play. So being able to have a community where we can meet and leave faction colors at the door and foster this productive communication has just been a really inspiring movement, and the solidarity is just something I've never seen in the Foxhole community up to this point. And I'm looking forward to what progress we can make from here.
All right, Hannibal.
Hello there. I'm one of the leaders of T3C, which is the largest logistics dedicated clan in the game. Burnout for me is really our biggest enemy. At least in T3C, we try to limit burnout by working together and breaking tasks down into smaller tasks and facilitating players to only do the part of L.O.G.I that they really want to do. We very much have a culture in our clan of not telling our members what to do, not having set orders, but rather allowing them to do what part of logistics they want, and more importantly, have the knowledge that that's going to have an effect on the war, and that their resources, their time is going to be put to good use. So that those sorts of themes are something which we want to spread more out in Foxhole to generally reduce burnout across the game, but also we want to facilitate, or we want to advocate for ways to facilitate that within public L.O.G.I as well.
All right. Thank you, Hannibal. Alabastor?
Hello. Happy to be here. So, me, I used to go under a different name, but after a historical event that happened in, it was War 57, the war before they removed Alabastor Island from Orbreaker and moved it over to Tempest. I named myself Alabastor after the successful landing ship invasion of that island and subsequent events that followed. Those that were there would know about this. So my key focus in the game is landing ships, but they sadly don't come out day one. So earlier on in the war, my job is to facilitate delivery of stuff. So I get people and organize them into freighters and trucks, and we do all sorts of operations to stock safe houses and stock frontline L.O.G.I hubs with emplacements and pallets and also all the sort of backbone things that make the faction be able to function. I don't like mining. I don't like harvesting, so I get to really work with in T3C. That's where I really am able to thrive, because I have access to all these resources and I can be this distribution guy.
All right, thank you. And Bazlow, you're up next.
Okay. Hello, Jeffrey. I'd like, as everyone else here, to say thank you and to share our appreciation for giving us an opportunity to talk about our open letter today. For me personally, I've been playing on and off since 2018, in a time before World Conquest and War Numbers. For me, burnout struck first after the World Conquest. The world became much larger, and those who I would see and socialize with became less and less often seen, as we had to travel much further. A lot of players stopped being a common sight, and that drift and that loss of a social interaction became something which eventually allowed me to stop logging in and having no concerns about the consequences of doing so. I've come back multiple times between then, and I meet great new people, but the same thing happens. They stop showing up, the social interaction dies down, and names soon become things that we just remember. This community, which we have fostered and created here, where we have come together and helped remind ourselves that we share many common threads in this game, that we have similar concerns, and that while we may be on the other side, if we were on the same side, we would all get along just as well as we have done so here. Thank you.
All right. Last but not least, we'll come around back to General Retreat.
Hello again. So I started playing in the mid to late War 70s, I guess. And from the very first time I started playing, I wanted to be involved with logistics because I've done trading and similar economy-based stuff in other games that I've played. So that appealed to me, and there didn't seem to be any other games like Foxhole where this kind of system was represented, at least that I could find. And I had this really vivid memory of the first session that I started playing. I think there was a warden attack going on in Crumbling Passage where they were trying to take back Overlook Hill while being completely surrounded. And I was the only logistics truck that was going in and dropping off shirts periodically to stop the relic base completely running out of respawns. And I think when you've got that kind of gameplay experience where people are recognizing you when your truck turns up and everyone's like, yay, the logistics guys have turned up, that's a really compelling gameplay experience. Like initially, I was planning on being neutral and just going with whatever team was on a losing streak, and the Wardens were on a very long losing streak at that point.
Mm-hmm.
But I must say, it was when I joined FMAT. It was, as Bazlow said, the social experiences and the social interactions, like the friends that you make, which really made me stick with the Wardens. And I'm sure there's plenty of people on the colonial side that have had the same experience. Where it's not so much faction loyalty, but it's more loyalty to the people that you know and enjoy hanging out with and playing the game with. So that was what has really kept me with Foxhole, is playing the game with people that I enjoy hanging out with. I will say that for me personally, the point of burnout was that travel times got so long with the Entrenched update. Like I played all the way through War 83, and that was a really fun experience, but it just wasn't sustainable. And if you're dealing with a situation where you don't feel it's sustainable, you just go and do something else. And while we do break the logistics loop up into lots of smaller little tasks, you do get to a point where it's quite hard to motivate yourself to log in and continue to play, and it's just would be nice if the mechanics supported more compelling loops on a smaller scale, where there wasn't that time investment, so you could just drop in, do a little thing, and then go out again. But yeah, that's where I kind of stand at the moment, and currently I'm investing, I would say, more of my intention with L.O.G.I, like the Logistics Union, as an organisation that I am actually in the game at the moment, but that's just because things are so mad with the server right now where it's growing so quickly. But yeah, that's how things stand at the moment.
All right, thank you, all of you, for that. And I know we want to get to the letter, and we absolutely will. But just kind of in response to all of those opening statements there, I kind of want to open it up, and I'll ask all of you this. And with all this talk about burnout, logistics burnout, I don't want to log in anymore, et cetera, et cetera. Is there a sense of like, hey, maybe you just need to take a break, or you just need to pull away from the game because you're playing the game too much, or that you feel like you're investing far much more than is reasonable? Like maybe are you just putting it upon yourselves to supply everything for everyone, and you're just kind of stressing yourself out too much? What would you say to that?
I do naval invasion operations, and if I want to do a naval invasion from a mid-region into the enemy frontline or backline, and I don't have a specific set of items that I need, I'm going to need to do a delivery from the backline, and that can take an hour or something. So it's not even possible to just do one thing. It's like you burn out even when you're just trying to do one cycle.
In terms of people that say, if you're not enjoying the game, just don't play the game. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I do agree with that. Like, one of the messages that we have been putting out is if you're not having fun, then step back. And one of the nice things about L.O.G.I as an organisation is that there are so many like-minded people there that have similar interests that you're almost certainly going to share a lot of the games that you play with some of the people there. So that said, the reason that we're doing this is because we do love the game, and even if we're not enjoying the moment-to-moment experience in some situations, we can clearly see that there are ways that it could be improved to allow us to enjoy it even more. In terms of overinvestment of time, though, I think one of the important questions that you would need to ask at that point is, for hours invested, why does logistics seem to be so much more disproportionately affected by this issue than any other section of the game? And surely it has to be a consequence of the way that the mechanics are currently formed.
And if I may, we have actually got a survey that we've put out, and this is also on LOGIUnion.com, and it is actively ongoing. We've had close to 400 responses now, and of the 392 responses of people who are the question of, have you ever consciously decided to reduce how much Foxhole you play, we're at about 66.8% people saying yes to that question, which is about 262 people. Likewise, we've also got, do you personally know someone who has decided to stop playing Foxhole entirely, of which the 390 responses, 200 have said yes? And do you feel logistics causes burnout in players? We've had, of 389 responses, 371 have said yes, and 18 have said no. So, mind you, this is from a survey that was proposed to the Union of Logistics Players, but I feel like those are some potentially pretty telling numbers on that front.
So, yeah, I think that kind of not quite nips it in the bud, but there's certainly a self-terminating thought of, if you don't like it, don't play the game, which, I mean, for the record, that is kind of how you should play games, all games, or do all things at all times. But, yeah, there's just nothing quite like Foxhole, and there's a strong sense of FOMO, fear of missing out, as it's called. I know for every war that passes by, we don't do PressCorps things. I get that sense as well. But if I don't get around to making news reports for each war, all right, it's whatever, right? People will live with that. In terms of logistics, don't get me wrong. If people don't do logistics, people will live. But the gameplay will probably be disproportionately affected, and it's kind of a nasty downstream, as we have seen, right? It's self-evident that a lot of people aren't having a good time. So with that, we'll probably let's move on to the open letter here, and I believe we'll hand it off to you guys. Question: Was this a ranked list? Like, is this in order of importance?
How we made the list, which was on our Discord, we accepted feedback, and we still accept feedback in a channel where anyone can agree to put in whatever issues they have with L.O.G.I. And we have people going through that list, and we add it to a massive Excel spreadsheet. We have people taking out redundancies and doing all sorts of different metrics on it. But essentially, we had a committee come in and go through all the different issues and find out which issues we thought would be most relevant to present to PressCorps, and which ones we also think would be low-hanging fruit in terms of gains to the L.O.G.I community, but we believe the devs could implement relatively easy. Most of them, there is one or two exceptions. Most of these we believe would be very easy from a dev side to change.
One of the main focuses was potentially changes that could be introduced with a minor patch or a hot patch. Some of the items are probably more complex, like the regiment queues for production buildings, but we can get to that in due course.
Guys, I'll hand it off to you guys, and just want to go through point by point for the open letter to the devs. We won't read the whole thing because you can just read that, but we'll start with the points.
Yeah. So I guess we can start with the numbered issues that we'd set out on the letter itself. So first, I think we'll cover the pull times from public stockpiles. So this is how long it takes to assemble goods from a stockpile at a depot or a seaport, or how long it takes to take goods out of a refinery or a similar production building. The ramifications of this current pull time, they touch on a lot of different issues, and I understand the reason why the pull times are currently the way they are. So they're intended as an anti-griefing measure, as far as I understand it, to stop someone from completely emptying out a stockpile. But I would argue currently that the excessive amount of time it takes to withdraw goods from a public stockpile is probably actually more damaging than the impact that alts or griefers or anything like that could ever possibly have. And the reason I say that is because currently, if you want to manage a supply chain where different roles are, like, different steps of the supply chain are broken down through different people, so say like backline production, then shipping to the midline to the front line, the only practical way to do that currently is through private reserve stockpiles. And the limiting factor of these stockpiles is that you're really stuck with sharing them with people that you either directly know and trust, or alternately putting a sign next to a stockpile with the access codes so anyone can access it. The risk with this latter approach is that any items inside a reserve stockpile, those goods are still reservable, which means any of those goods can be instantaneously and untraceably transported into another private stockpile. So if you wanted to make a huge number of BMATs available to the public for use, you could put them in a private reserve stockpile, but you have no way of monitoring whether or not they were just taken by lots of people that wanted to do manufacturing, or if a bad faith actor had just sucked them all into a private reserve stockpile so they could use them later. So that's not an ideal solution either. Ultimately, what we would like to see is the timers on public stockpiles being reduced so that you could end up with these big decentralized supply networks where, say, organized regimental or clan logistics at a backline could mass export manufactured goods to a midline, fill up a seaport, and then like solo players, non-regimental players would be able to pick those up at their own leisure and distribute to the front lines. Currently, this kind of approach is kind of discouraged because it's just such a lengthy and painful process to pull items out of a public stockpile. And this kind of stands in direct contrast with the stated objectives of the game as well, which is to maximize teamwork and interaction between players. So currently, you can have these kind of like role-based and section-by-section supply chains, but it's very difficult to do it outside of regiments or small groups of trusted parties that cooperate with one another. What we would really like to see is a system that enables and encourages like wide organic cooperation between solo players, and I think public stockpiles are the best way to facilitate that, but only if the pull times are more realistic, if you want to encourage that kind of stuff. Happy to throw that open to the floor for discussion as well.
Yeah. So I agree with everything you've said. The most compelling argument I can present to the devs for why they should reduce the pull times is the ubiquitous of the signs outside the depots with fast pull written on them and a code there, and people can just... We're basically circumventing the slow pull time. This war that's going on right now is the most widespread I've ever seen this, and it is so successful. Everyone loves it, so I just think that alone would be the evidence that the pull times need to be reduced. The other reason why the long pull times are so bad is because if you wanted to pull a whole lot of stuff and then move it forward to somewhere that's a bit... It's still safe, it's not all the way at the front, but it's maybe a midline, and then you submitted it into that depot, you would then have to go through the same painful process of pulling it all from public again to then deliver it to the next depot up the chain. So it's got to be fixed. This is a big one.
I'd like to add on to Alabastor's point there, where he's talking about the adoption of these public signs. What we're seeing there is players actively circumventing the slow pull, but more importantly, we're seeing players actively circumventing the anti-griefing system that the developers have put into the game, because the players believe that the benefits of this outweigh the consequences that could come from allowing everyone access to a fast pull stockpile.
I'd also like to add on to that. We are seeing more adoption of fast pull signs in the game. However, I've talked to a lot of people from my clan, other people, and there's a fundamental fear amongst a lot of L.O.G.I players of the if they put stuff in the fast pull, will everyone just be taken? I don't want anyone to get the wrong impression. It's good that it's being adopted, but it's not a solution in and of itself. If anything, it's creating more opportunities for griefing.
Yeah.
If we believe that there needs to be a solution which has a balance, which is in the public domain, and has a balance between having faster pull times, but also having security mechanisms. And at the end of this, I'll go over a couple of different methods that are being proposed on the Discord.
The logs, like the logs that are on the public, the fact you can't put it into your own reserve on the public, with the fast pull, we lose those security measures. So it's like, it's not a good place to be, and we want those pull times reduced, because that's the real solution.
The other downside of using the fast pull reserves as well is that you can't see those reserves on the map until you've actually been to them and unlocked them with the code, and it pretty heavily penalises, especially solo players who are maybe just dipping in for the first time, or maybe don't consistently do logistics, so it's just something they do occasionally. So ideally, and what we would want to see with the public stockpiles is that it's a central pool of resources that any player can see immediately on the map. And if someone is just doing occasional part-time logistics, then they can have a browse over their map. They can see that a front line maybe that they've just been fighting on is starved of a particular resource, and they can browse back and look at the midline, which is relatively close by to where they are. See that the public stockpile has been reasonably stocked with goods, because the mechanics encourage people to actually do that. And they can just head over there, they can respawn at that midline point, they can pick up a boat or a flatbed or whatever, and they can move those resources out, because they could see them from the other side of the map without having been there first to actually plug the codes in.
As General said, that is one of the key benefits there. But following up with Alabastor's point as well, where we're talking about the security of these here, the players have adopted something which is inherently less secure than if the pull timers were just reduced from the public stockpile. I think that genuinely shows that players are willing to completely go and distance themselves from the public system, which in itself is of a state of mind of being absolute. Nobody is trusted at all to get fast access to that there. And so where we have players now with these private stockpiles which are publicly accessible, we have sacrificed so much just for that fast pull. Surely that there should justify that we need faster pull access from public.
Yeah, it seems like it's worth it from what all of you are saying and what's been happening in the game, at least in terms of that end of logistics.
We've identified 4 main different methods suggested for dealing with the security issues in the public pull time, which I want to go over. Some of these would be super easy for the devs to implement, such as just flatly reducing the amount of public pull time. However, we also have suggested, which is quite popular, for more contents in a stockpile, for faster stuff pull out. That way you don't have issues of stockpiles being completely driven dry by griefers, but you still have relatively high pulls when things start to pile up. Another one was by level, with the idea that levels in this game is different to ranks. So a level you get mostly from factory work. So the idea being there is the more factory work you do, the higher up your level, and so contributed more, so you should be able to pull stuff out more. But someone mentioned that the devs have also been playing around in Dev Branch with a information system, a number which gathers the amount of reservable stuff you've put into public. And we've identified that might also be a really good way to say, the more stuff you put into public, the more right you have to deserve to pull stuff out faster from the public stockpile, and also more incentive for people to put stuff in public because they want that faster pull time. The final one is by the amount of people in the region. The idea being that the more people in the region, the pull time should be faster for 2 reasons. One, the idea will there'll probably be more people at the seaport, so the seaport needs to be unclogged faster. And 2, the idea that someone will probably be less likely to grieve if there was a lot of people around. So those are the 4 main identified solutions in that area.
I think when the devs initially set it up, this was during a time when Foxhole was obviously much smaller, and the community was, on average, only about maybe 300 to 500 or 600 at the most being online. So when you're talking about those kinds of numbers, a single individual trying to grief and pull crates could be very damaging. But we're in a much different environment now. We've got those player logs, so we can keep an eye on people for what they're depositing or withdrawing, and we can also see a much larger population now on average. So the impacts of a single individual is much less. Meanwhile, the impacts of slower pull times on the players is much higher compared to then.
Moving on to the next point. Okay, acquiring early game components. So for those that don't know, you can only start getting components out of a component field once with tech sledgehammers. So this means for the first 5 or so days, the only way to get components is to work a component mine. And the only way to make component mines efficient is by bringing them refined crude oil into petrol. In a rush to get other early AMAT material, and in the case where it's set that early concrete is a thing, it really causes different clans and different groups to want to go and they want to get the components out of a component mine so they can go do what they want to do. But they can't just sit there and, well, they can't just go away and come back and get the components because the component mines are a zero-sum game. Someone gets all the components or someone gets none of the components. So what we've been seeing is we've been seeing clan actors and other individual actors getting their petrol and going to the mines and sitting there until they have enough. And sort of an etiquette's kind of evolved, saying if someone has petrol, you should leave them alone. This isn't necessarily a good game experience for people in the game, because if you're a new player, this is where one of our main concerns lies, and you want to get components for a flatbed, which is crucial in doing inland L.O.G.I in some of the areas on the map, then you have to go and you have to go out and you have to go deal with these clan members trying to get comps for their clans, and it can lead to some very, frankly, toxic behavior. And so we have some ideas for some solution on how to mitigate this, but it really is a big pain point for us.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with all of that. So as Hannibal said, the way that the mines are approached is effectively a zero-sum equation where it generates conflict inside the faction. I think game mechanics that encourage conflict are fine when it's across faction lines, because that's the entire point of the game. You want to be encouraging competition over resources, securing fields, that kind of thing, because that adds strategic depth to the game. But anything that's encouraging internal conflict, it strikes me as potentially misguided. I mean, certainly in the early game, because of the scarcity of component mines, and I know this was at least partially addressed on the most recent dev branch by there being much more component mines. I don't know if this fully addresses the issue, however, because the root problem is still there, which is that the component mines, they are gradually producing components over time, and only one person can receive the produced components. So either you get them or someone else does, unless you choose to share. And there's no real mechanical incentive for people to share, because ultimately there are so many vitally important items that need the components and the RMATs that everyone is primarily looking out for their own interests. I think for L.O.G.I particularly, the biggest pain point is securing the flatbeds, because flatbeds are necessary for so much logistics work in terms of inland transportation, as Hannibal said, all the way up to efficiently making use of resource fields. So if you've got the resource fields with resource containers and cranes, that's when you're best able to get a good harvesting operation going, with flatbeds going back and forth to the refinery. The fact that particularly new players can be locked out of that experience and locked out of flatbeds almost, because they don't understand the unofficial code of conduct around component mines. I mean, that's just fundamentally a bad a bad experience for them and more generally for everyone that is currently trying to make use of these mines. I mean, like Hannibal said, there's a few different solutions that we had thought of, whether that's changing flatbeds from like an RMAT vehicle to a BMAT one, a bit like the change to freighters with entrenched, because freighters were so essential to dealing with the expanded map. Similarly, freighters are essential to pretty much everything that isn't on water, so like the same logic would seem to apply there.
What was the change to freighters, for those that don't know?
So previously they cost RMATs to produce, I believe.
No, so the change in the trench was they brought the tech for freighters back. It used to be teched about a week in, I believe, and they made it so that you could get it early war. Freighters having cost RMATs in, you could probably tell me, Alabastor, how long has it been now?
I've been playing since 45. They've costed 500 BMATs the entire time I've been playing.
Yeah, so that's a very old thing. But no, they made it so that it was available early on. And having these L.O.G.I vehicles available and out of a resource that is noob friendly could go a very long way. We understand that this zero-sum game in terms of the component mines isn't something that can be easily fixed, which is why our key flagstone suggestion has been to change flatbeds to BMATs, just so that new players don't have to get into that whole quagmire.
I would like to touch on just how essential flatbeds are to the whole early war logistics structure, and just how important of a resource they are. Flatbeds, trucks are good, but flatbeds are essentially the lifeblood of landlocked L.O.G.I. That is the best way you can move large sources of resources from the back lines to the mid lines, and from there to the front lines wherever they're needed. And clans, once they have secured those flatbeds, that's like gold, essentially. There are tons of times where you'll be in a flatbed hauling stuff to the front, and you'll see a new player that is asked to or a solo L.O.G.I who is asked to use your flatbed. And as much as you would love to give it to them, you can't you don't want to take the risk of losing that flatbed knowing how much effort goes into producing it.
Why don't you just use a crane?
Well, you get into the problem there of, do you want to take a crane 3 hexes to get your shipping crate of supplies up there? That's arguably, yeah, you could, but I don't think anybody here really wants to do it with how inefficient that would be with your time. And time management and the time it takes for logistics players to put it is one of our core issues that kind of ties all these together, is time.
You need the flatbed for the emplacements, for the pallets. There's things in the game that it's essential. It's 100% essential.
Yeah.
Yes,
the more updates we've seen, the more importance has been placed on flatbeds.
Yes, this is something that's now come to the forefront, especially with the pallets. We're seeing pallets, and they cost 50 basic materials. And wouldn't it be great if we could take those pallets, like we saw on the dev stream, and bring the sandbags to the front? And then at the front, those guys can quickly build sandbag walls. That would be amazing. But that's not what's happening, because that 50 basic materials of sandbags is being gatekept by the 30 refined materials that a flatbed is costing. A player at the front is not going to pause what they're doing to go back to the back lines, to go to the oil well, get their 3 cans of crude oil, go to the refinery, come back with their petrol, go to the component mine, wait the 6 minutes at the component mine, assuming it's not occupied, and then take those components to a refinery to get their 30 refined materials, to then go to the construction yard to put their 50 basic material sandbag onto their 30 refined materials vehicle, and then drive it to the front, and oh goodness, would you look at the time, it's been 2 hours.
Yeah, if I can add while we transition to the next topic, I'll quickly say the early components were just such a toxic element to me personally in our regiment that I've pretty much written it out completely, that we just don't mess with the component mines whatsoever until they stop getting camped early war. Anyway, yeah, so to Alabastor on discussion about the factory orders and the whole time we get for retrieving them when they finish.
If there's no one else using the factory and you're the first person to put your queues on, the queues take I'll just say 5 minutes for most of the items. So 5 minutes is fine. But If you're the fourth queue to be put in the factory, which is the fourth and final queue, this can take 20 minutes to half an hour. And then once your order is complete, your order can then sit in the factory for, I believe it's half an hour. Can someone else confirm that? It's half an hour, right?
30 minutes, yes.
30 minutes before it drops to public, and then the items are no longer reservable and they're public. So if you're trying to build up your own stockpile, and you have to sort of set a timer to come back to the factory and pick up your stuff, and you might be sitting in that L.O.G.I town. Yeah, you can find some other jobs to do for 20 minutes while you wait, but often this is the kicker. If you're trying to get bunker supplies or garrison supplies, these items take 15 minutes per crate, so it's going to take an hour for the whole queue if you're the fourth person. So you have to come back after an hour to pick up your order. So this is just, it becomes this weird like scenario where you don't want to hang around because it's too long, so you want to go do something else, but then often you can't come back in time to pick up your order if it's a shorter run, or if it's the longer run for the bunker supplies items. It's just, can someone else speak to this?
What I can say about this here is that what we're looking at, where we take a look at the collection timer, is something that's been with us for several years, and it's only in the most recent update since about war, where we've seen these bunker supplies with 16-minute production times, where if you're the fourth in the queue, you get your slot to collect in 1 hour 3 minutes, but you only have 30 minutes from that 1 hour 3 minutes to collect it. It made sense whenever we had a smaller world and we had less people at the factory, but now where we have vastly expanded world and vastly bigger production times, the 30 minutes seems to have been overlooked, and this is causing a considerable amount of discontent, especially amongst the builders who come back and find your order's finished, you didn't collect it in time, it's gone public.
One of the main pain points in this section is L.O.G.I drivers and people that work for factory have complained to us, or have mentioned to us, that they feel like they always have to be stuck at the factory. This is true for people doing frontline deliveries as well. Often it can take 30 minutes in and of itself to get into another region to get back. We're having cases where L.O.G.I drivers go set their queues, and depending on what the item is, they get delayed by partisans or something, they come back and suddenly their queues are in public, which it might not be the bad thing, depending on the type of frontline delivery player, but like that incessant fear of having to get back in time, otherwise someone else might pick up your stuff, and it hurts. It hurts L.O.G.I players a lot.
This is a problem.
That's a sort of...
Sorry, you keep going.
Yeah, that sort of experience, that sort of like negative experience, is something we want to, if we could just remove it, we should remove it for the sake of removing it.
This is a problem that stacks on top of the slow pull time from public. That's why you're picking up your crates of veins or tank shells or something. It's so important, because you don't want to lose that crate, because it's going to take you so long to pull it out of public if you have to. So that's another... It weaves back into that public pull time issue.
Yeah, I fully agree with that last point as well, because like if you're producing goods at a backline L.O.G.I hub, I mean, outside of things like garrison supplies, bunker supplies, if you're producing general equipment, if that's released to public and it ends up in the seaport, if you knew that a public freighter was going to turn up and they were going to pull things out of the public stockpile and it was actually going to get to where it needed to go, that would be absolutely fine. But as it stands at the moment, it can take upwards of an hour to fill a freighter from a public stockpile, so people just don't do it. And that really adds frustration to the fact that if you've been manufacturing in a backline hex and something is released to public, you know there is very little chance that it's actually going to end up at a destination where it's useful.
The other point about this here, where the drivers come back, if they miss the deadline, the best case scenario is that they go back to the factory and they see that their crates are still there, but they're now tainted as being non-reservable. And the worst case scenario is they put something expensive in, they didn't get to collect it in time, and who knows where it is now.
And this is one of those issues that kind of comes back to one of our common threads, which is just that there should be consistency between features. And the real solution to this is kind of bring it in line with the other timers that we have for both the BMS that you can order and stuff to that regard, where you get 48 hours to pick up your goods. So it should either be increased or just made consistent with other factors that kind of play into it, which is also a new player easement where everything is consistent along the same line. There's no confusion of, well, why is this one thing that's similar to everything else different from all the others?
Okay, next one is
That's my one. So production buildings. Let's talk about the MPF, right? So the MPF, you go there, you take a bunch of materials, and you can put an order on for either small arms, advanced weapons, vehicles, structure containers, which is your emplacements and your pallets, or uniforms. We're going to talk mainly right now about the RMAT costing vehicles, like tanks, okay? So I put a full queue of tanks on, 5 containers. This contains 15 tanks. It's very expensive. It's one of the most expensive queues in the game. I am in a big squad, or regiment, my regiment T3C. The RMATs were collected by everyone in the regiment, not just me. We've pulled our resources together and we've built up this stockpile of RMATs. Now I want to go and put on this big queue of beautiful, expensive tanks. I go to the MPF, I put the RMATs in, and I want to make it so someone else in my regiment can pick up these tanks. But there isn't a regiment squad lock system on the queue. It's a squad lock on the queue. So I select that squad lock. I then leave the MPF. I then go away, do other stuff. Then the queue is finished, so it's ready for pickup. Some random guy hops in our squad, goes to the MPF, and he can pull those container of tanks out of our MPF queue. And because T3C, we're a public L.O.G.I squad, we keep our squad open so other people can join us and help us, and we can help them, and we work together. So because of that system we run, where we're always got our squad unlocked, we get abused. And people will come into our squad and literally steal our shit out of the MPF all the time. And we'll see things going missing, like full queues of tanks, full queues of expensive guns, full queues of ammo, tank shells, 68mm, and it's just so frustrating. And we feel that this would be just resolved so easily. Well, it wouldn't resolve it, but I think it would give us a little bit more security, would be to move that from being a squad lock system at the MPF to being a regiment locked system at the MPF. So that at least they have to be in our regiment.
So we've also heard, talking to different logistics drivers, that are in regiments, that sometimes clans want to have separate squads for L.O.G.I, and sometimes their clan members aren't actually in their squad because it's full or because other stuff is happening. Sometimes in T3C we get locked out of our own squad because someone goes AFK and the thing gets full, and suddenly we don't have access to any of our stockpiles. So opening that up, that you can choose to put it into clan, and that anyone can access that from the clan, means that they don't have to be in squad, which is it's a good thing.
Beyond the MPF as well, I think having a regiment queue on refineries would be an absolute game changer. If only because having the personal or public being the only options means that if you're taking a long weekend or something where you're not going to be available to go into the game, all of those resources are just going to drop out and come public. However, if there was an option to share your stockpile reserves with your regiment, that would allow a better sharing of resources. I think one of the other weaknesses as well of the existing squad options for production buildings, so the MPFs and factories, is that there are hard caps on the squad size limit, and there are workarounds for that in terms of how you can invite more people into the squad, but it is a very frustrating system to deal with, and I'm sure many regiments would be appreciative of the option of being able to have multiple squads inside the regiment instead of having a single squad, which is basically a synonym for the regiment. It just allows more operational flexibility and such.
One more addition to that, so have a regiment locked for the MPF, or you could do this for the refinery as well. Have it regiment locked, but then also have a similar system to the reserve system. so that I can put something on. I can put a queue of tanks on at the MPF, and then there's a code there, and I can give the code to anyone I want to. Might be another. I'm just trying to think of other. I don't want to point at a problem and not provide any solution. So that would be another possible solution.
Tying themes back together, I've encountered a lot of L.O.G.I players, but like to drive scrap to a refinery, but don't like to pull it out. So having regiment queues in the refinery will also enable people that don't like pulling out their BMATs to not have to do that, which will have a one-on effect. That's another area of L.O.G.I where you're getting less burnout for people doing what they don't want to do.
And that would be particularly important for tech materials as well, because it means that you'd be able to aggregate those across an entire regiment, which would make it easier to create them as well, because generally you're refining relatively low numbers of tech mats at once. So being able to pool tech mats across everyone involved in a scrapping operation, so you could get to that magical 20 number for a crate quicker would be much better as well.
It really just sounds like a lot of the systems throughout Foxhole just need to be infused with the proper regiment system beyond the bare bones. So I know there is like an independent regimental. Actually, is there a regiment chat? I don't think so, right?
Yeah,
There is.
There is, but it's not like a regiment voice chat.
Not voice.
No.
Yeah, not
the
voice
regiment system
chat.
does just seem to float on top of everything else without being fully connected, though.
Mhm.
At least that's the impression that I've got.
Yeah, we could do a whole spiel. I know I've made a whole spiels about revamping the communications system and really just fleshing that out, but we won't get into that here, although it would certainly help in all aspects, not just logistics. Was anyone here present for the operations system? I think that's 2 years ago.
Yes.
That was removed. Okay, Alabastor, you remember that. What were your thoughts on that? And Bazlow?
It's obsolete, and I'm glad it's gone. I love the new systems. The reserve system is excellent.
Okay.
I cannot complain at all about it. We all love the reserve system. The way we've got a code network thing. I don't want to go too much into this, but we keep codes and we share them with all our guys, and it's really good. So we love it.
Do wonder
I'm
if
of the same mind of Alabastor, though. The old operational stockpiles that we had were loot pinatas out in the middle of the countryside.
Mm-hmm.
It's much better now that we have the operational stockpiles ingrained as part of the seaport or the stockpile in a town that's actually defendable. Everyone will rally around their structure because they understand its importance, and it's not just one clan calling out for help because their private stockpile somewhere off in the distance is being ambushed by partisans.
something that public players wouldn't be able to, or non-regimented players wouldn't be able to access anyway.
And they have no clue it's there because they can't see it if it's private. I mean, they can't see it on the map even if it isn't private. But one more thing I just want to tack onto this is regiment would be good for like all the production stuff, but then just keep squad for voice comms and vehicle squad locks. But also you want to put the regiment lock for your storm cannons as well. You want to plug those into the regiment system too. But that's it.
Oh, actually, one idea that's just occurred to me with regiments and reserve stockpiles, it would be amazing if when you created a stockpile, you had a button that said share with regiment, so you didn't need to enter a code if you were part of the same regiment as the owner.
That ties into our next section we're going into. Our containers do not allow for closed loop logistics, which ties largely into the issue of backhauling, which we'll start off with what the with.
Yeah, so something I've always found odd, and I'd like your thoughts on this as well here really quick, Jeffrey. Have you done a delivery using a flatbed or a freighter recently in one of the more recent wars or in the past?
Not recently. I'm old school, and whenever I do logistics, it's usually far back line scrapping, and I just stick to the truck. And this actually probably adds to another point, which is that it's just so gosh darn hard to get a flatbed, so I don't even bother, and I just stick to the small scale trucking. So not really helping your point here, but certainly to another one.
No worries. Well, so something that everyone will always experience if they ever do a flatbed delivery or a freighter delivery to the front is you'll have them strap up with shipping containers, fill them up with crates, and then they go to one of those forward depots or a seaport. They load them into there. You dump them in public if you want it to go to the people in general or to a specific stockpile if it needs to get pushed further or for specific people to distribute. But then you don't have a good reason to turn around. You now have an empty freighter or an empty flatbed. You might have a resource container in that town. You might be lucky that the place you go to has a construction yard and you could spend a little bit of time making one. But ultimately, you end up leaving shipping containers there at that front line. And this is repeated multiple times every day with multiple delivery people, that you're going to see at those frontline stockpiles 100 shipping containers at any point of time in the war. And it'll just keep happening over and over and over, with no good way to get those back to the rear.
Just to build on that as well, I think some of the problems that we face as well are the fact that, particularly when we're looking at front lines, one of the main bottlenecks with front lines are population. And when a hex is fully populated, it's basically impossible. You're not going to see people doing resource harvesting. So you immediately have this issue where if a resource needs direct player intervention in order to generate, you're not going to see any resources being generated that can be taken back from the front line to a back line or a midline or wherever. And that problem is kind of exacerbated by the fact that if you've got a load of shipping containers, mechanically it is impossible to put raw resources into those containers. So even if there was something that was worth taking back, which was maybe scrapped during low pop hours or whatever, it's very difficult to actually set up the infrastructure to enable that return trip. And really what we'd like to see from a solution is some kind of positive incentive to encourage people to make those return trips, rather than negative incentivization. So like a negative incentivization would be punishing people for not doing something that was seen as beneficial rather than encouraging them to actually do it. I mean, so that could be like just making things too expensive to abandon or some similar mechanic, but that doesn't seem to be a good way to address the issue.
If we go back and look at our poll again, out of the different areas of L.O.G.I we poll people's opinion on, backhauling has a overwhelmingly negative response. 276 people out of about 380 said that backhauling had a poor experience in the game. That being said, I would like to talk about backhauling a bit in general, because in my opinion, backhauling isn't an issue in and of itself. Rather, it's a bunch of subcategories of issues that create this perception of what backhauling is. So I'll break it down into three main issues. Availability of L.O.G.I trucks and containers in the backline. If you're in the back line and you're thinking, oh, I really don't want to hammer out a freighter, then you look at a frontline depot and the depot has 100 freighters in it. And why do I need to hammer out a freighter when there's 100 freighters over there? A pile-up issue in the front line. People complaining that our stockpiles get piled up, which I believe the devs have decided to increase the limit, things that could be stored there. But in general, being able to recreate containers, and we create freighters and we create vehicles so that they can free up more space and they can be shipped back if people want them in the back lines. Good thing. But seeing that pile up just makes people think, oh, we don't have the stuff in the back line. We should be able to bring it out of the front line, frontline depots, and it makes people trying to deliver stuff to the frontline depots being like, oh, I can't submit my freighter or containers because it's full. And the third one is the negative feeling when driving empty. Players do not like to drive empty, which is why, because of the general low cost of vehicles, we get so many people leaving R1 haulers at the front line. How I would deal with this, which my opinion is not necessarily in the majority, wouldn't necessarily be giving more things to backhaul, because even in real life, backhauling is the worst part of logistics. It's something that in real life people do because they have to because of truck costs. But in the game, if we were to facilitate the creation of more L.O.G.I vehicles, which ties into us changing flatbeds to BMATs to make them more ubiquitous, then players won't feel like they need to drive the truck back unless they want to, which is a good thing. It means more stuff gets supplied to the front, but more importantly, it means that players are doing what they want to do. They don't necessarily have to have the chore of having to build all these trucks by hand over time because they're out, or by driving their truck back empty. So one of the main solutions that have sort of been proposed in this section was adding the MPT bonus to a lot of logistic vehicles. So people would be more willing to ship around crates of 5 logistics vehicles and to mass make them at higher quantities to keep up with the general public demand for L.O.G.I vehicles. So does anyone else want to add to that?
I think something that could be really helpful would be in the MPF splitting vehicles into civilian and military, because as it stands, in like especially towards the mid and late war, it's kind of like a very bad thing to be producing crates of trucks when you could be creating crates of tanks. Like splitting the production a little bit would probably help with keeping logistics supply balanced as well. I mean, I'll leave it at that. I mean, I'm sure other people have things to say.
We'll move on to Knight.
I just wanted to make a quick addendum, thank you, by the way, to the whole crating vehicles and resource containers things. This would be something that would be purely limited to resource crates as well as shipping containers, and then flatbeds, trucks, and freighters. Because we don't want to be able to recrate tanks. This would just be for logistic stuff to kind of incentivize mass taping and shipping back resources or containers and logistic vehicles if people were incentivized to do so. That way you're not just taking one ship back, you're taking 6 ships back or more in the case of, multiple crates of things coming back.
But devs already have code for checking if something has a gun on it and can't be put into a reserve stockpile. So I imagine it will be the same code. Can it be? Does it have a gun on it? No, it doesn't have a gun on it. Enable us to repackage it.
I wasn't aware of that. Is that somewhere in patch notes or a dev blog, or did the dev confirm it?
So if you've got a reservable crate of tanks you've made in the MPF, you can't unpackage it to reserved. It can only be unpackaged to public. This is being done intentionally to enable other sort of public players to get a chance to get some of these tanks.
Yeah, combat vehicles can never be stored in your reserve once they're single vehicles. You can store the container of 3, but you can't store the individual combat vehicles in your reserves.
I'd like to chime in a little bit on the closed-loop logistics here, because it strikes me as something which I might have been present for the conception of the problem that we're now discussing. When the containers, the flatbeds, and the cranes were introduced, we had a strange summer where players were going around in scrap squads, and they would deplete the fields and they would fill the shipping containers that were dropped off there, and a continuous supply line of containers would arrive at the refineries, and players would turn around with an empty one and rush back to the squad. The containers would arrive with scrap, and once the basic materials were processed, those would go into the exact same container and be shipped off by other drivers to a region closer to the front, which would have factories, or there was just an immediate need for the basic materials there. One stage, I joined one of these squads, and Max, who is a developer, was helping out, I suppose, admiring the handiwork. And this was in Lynn of Mercy, as I recall. Some players were openly talking about how cool it would be to have a container that would gradually fill up and that you could see it gradually fill up with the materials that had been collected. I suspect that this idea may have been the kindling, because not long after, we saw on a dev stream a container that specifically held resources, and it would hold more resources, and you could see inside of it. This was pretty exciting at the time. After all, the driver collecting the basic materials isn't going to a scrap field, they're going to the refinery. And those fields were not on their road, and likewise, the driver from the scrap field was not going to the front, so he wasn't on that route either. Fast forward to now, though. We have player ports where freighters dock. They collect 5 resource containers filled to the brim, and and at these ports, and then they leave their empty ones in return, and they go back to the logistics hub. With the world's expansion, though, we have freighters departing logistics hubs bound for the front line with shipping containers filled with crates, and on their route they pass these player ports, but they can't use them. The potential for converting the shipping containers into resource containers would allow those freighter pilots to bring those containers back to the player ports on a return route and get fresh, filled resource containers with scrap, and that there would allow the loop to be completed. We don't have that now, but there's an awful lot of players who are sharing the same dream.
You also have the potential of small shipping containers, where people might want to build bases around Scrapfield with the idea that any small shipping containers they deliver, they can convert them, maybe using BMATs if it's in the field, which was one suggestion, but the main suggestion, small shipping container to field, deliver supplies, convert it to a resource container, and then fill up the resource container. So that way, those bases have something which, if someone comes with a flatbed, they feel like they're helping by delivering it backwards. You don't need to close the loop to such an extent that there's a one-for-one relationship where a freighter going up has to have a full stuff to come back. That's just impossible. It's not possible in real-life logistics, and it's not possible in Foxhole, but facilitating some small stuff would be good. Some small options that would help facilitate people bringing stuff back.
Yeah, this overall has been one of the most hotly debated topics in the L.O.G.I Union, just because there's so many possible routes of how to solve a system where we have this open loop of stuff going forward. And so yeah, this is, even though this is number 5 on the list, it is still one of the ones that seems very difficult to truly solve because of all the different ways you could solve it.
I believe the next point is me. That should be number 6. Yes. All right. So, which is the lack of midline logistics facility. So this specifically ties into facilities such as refineries and single factories across the midline. It is the line from Abandoned Ward north to Callahan's Passage and south down along that line kind of there. But in east-west lines, it's Abandoned Ward and those kind of lines there. And so the primary example here is that midline towns should occasionally get an additional factory or refinery buildings, both to cut down driving times for logistics players so they don't have to go all the way to the back lines or to seaports further back. They can just kind of man those midline factories to help support the front on a short-term notice. But this also has the benefit to both frontline players and to partisans and the like of getting more engagement, as well as for logistics players and such, more engagement with other fields of players. In the case of logistics players, it would be maybe having to fight off partisans trying to cut off routes between this place. The example here is the Abandoned Ward factory up to Crumbling Post in Callahan's Passage. There's a refinery there. And so right now in the current war, a logistics player could go from the Abandoned Ward to Crumbling Post, get his BMATs, bring them back, make stuff for the front lines there, and then deliver those wherever they need to go. And then, it's a nice kind of loop there that cuts down driving. And this incentivizes partisans and the like to try to cut off those routes. Another example is from the last war. Godscroft had a factory in Adolo, and there was a refinery up near, I want to say Partisan Island, but it might have been further up. And a couple of partisans had been able to go across the naval route there and cut off that land route between the two.
You mean Fisherman's, not Goldcroft?
Yeah, sorry. Fisherman's, 100%. But essentially...
Is this an east-west or northwest? North-south setup?
I think this was a north-south setup.
Okay, so
it's kind of hard to remember between wars. They blur together. Okay. But the point is, it's a refinery and a refinery and a factory, not within the same hex, but nearby enough that they can incentivize shorter drives for logistics players. The other key thing here is it gives regions that not necessarily not have a whole lot of incentive for frontliners to push towards, more reasons to hold down those grounds and create more engaging gameplay and tactical options within hexes. For example, besides the Crumbling Post refinery, if you go one region north up to Reaching Trail, there really isn't anything of logistical concern to drive players to defend those points besides scrap fields and mines, really, So it adds some more variety to that sort of thing. I'll open this up to anyone else who wants to contribute on this point.
Real quick, before we do that, so I actually I cannot confirm if this is what the dev's intention was, but my understanding is that the reason why you don't see as many logistics facilities in the middle, whether it's north, south, or east, west setup, or any permutation, my understanding is that that is actually intentional. That way, the deeper you push into one side pushes deeper into the enemy territory, it's intentionally more difficult to supply them. Much like in a scenario where, using a real world scenario, where Germany invaded Russia in World War II, you're kind of simulating that elongation of logistics lines. That is the point: is to make driving longer, logistics, more difficult to supply. That way, the side that's on the back foot has kind of gets a indirect buff by having shorter supply lines, and you kind of simulate that push and pull.
I understand that they're looking to avoid the snowball effect, where the more territory you control, the more resources you have, the more you can produce, the harder you can push, that kind of thing.
Right.
I do think that when the map was expanded and the productive regions were pushed even further back, I do think that has had a detrimental impact in terms of travel times and basically causing distribution of goods to become the core bottleneck for logistics. I understand that next year logistics is probably going to be the core theme of some of the updates, and those updates could well alleviate some of those problems. However, in the short term, immediate term, there should probably be some concessions on the map to acknowledge that those changes are not here yet. And the map as it exists at the current time is placing an extraordinary pressure on the logistics player base. And that could well be something along the lines of the old logistics hubs, the ones that were gutted with the map expansion, could be restored to some form of their previous state. So just as an example, you've got Kirknell in Viper's Pit with Howell County and Basin behind it as the new backline. You could have the free factory configuration restored to Kirknell, but the MPF staying on the backline. So the effective result there would be that you have the production of basic goods and the refineries and such being closer to the action, so the travel times are shorter. But the more expensive, like RMAT-based items, which you'd want to use the MPFs for to cut down on the cost, or crated vehicles or anything like that, they would still be produced on the backline and would need to be shipped the whole distance to the front. I mean, that's a potential solution where you're kind of striking a middle ground where, as a short-term concession to playability for L.O.G.I, those productive areas would be moved further forward, but you would still be having the backline as a productive region for, especially late war tech, where you do not want to be producing them in factories or places where you don't get that MPF cost bonus.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, this is another one of those points that we've kind of heavily talked about and discussed and tried to brainstorm possible solutions. It's one of those ones where we kind of know what the devs are intending, but it's very hard for logistics to make it work in its current state. And we're not asking for, refineries and factories everywhere. And if, we're going back to his suggestion of midline towns semi-resembling and regaining their industry, we could cut down the number of available factories and refineries quite significantly. So they're not as efficient as they were in wars of past, but there could still be, more tactical options for development.
Gotcha.
Yeah, absolutely. And, if basic production is happening further forward as well, like Knight of Britonnia said earlier on, it means that they are more accessible targets for partisans as well, because I don't imagine that partisans enjoy dealing with freighters at the moment, because most of the waterways are quite well protected and freighters are very, very tanky. But if the resource gathering fields and the productive regions are further forward, it's slightly less torturous for partisans to have to infiltrate that territory and then do their work. So I think that makes for a more engaging gameplay loop for both the attackers and the defenders in that sense.
I used to say, but there were two main types of logistics players. Are there other players that mass-made stuff in the back lines, ship them up with freighters, and then distribute from a depot? And then there were players that looked to see what was on the front line was needed, went scrapping, got the BMATs, did the factory with their R1 hauler, and then delivered whatever the front line needed at that time. As a colonial, we used to have a perspective that some public L.O.G.I player would just show up in an R1 hauler at the last minute, which a lot of the times was true, but we haven't been seeing that as much recently, because these R1 hauler L.O.G.I has to drive several regions over, and by the time they get there, often the front's dead or they no longer need what they need, and it's incredibly stressful for those for someone that to be seeing a front slowly dying and they can't get there in time.
Bazlow, do you have any views on this as a solo player yourself, in terms of the travel time and how that affects like non-regimental players?
Well, going back to single world maps where we had just a single region, I used to do driving from the scrap field to the factory to the front line. And even in the early World Conquest where we had the 9-map hex, it was possible to go to the back lines, do some scrapping, go to the factories, and then go and deliver it to the front. Speaking for myself and the experience of other solo players that I see, the larger map has forced a lot of solo players into specialized roles. There no longer is the vertical integration that we saw before. It's gone entirely. The scrapper who goes to the factory, who goes to the front line, that's not a thing anymore. And that's not to say that that's a bad thing. We've certainly seen some exciting and interesting replacements to it. I can speak candidly about the ports that players have developed, and I can tell you that an awful lot of the people who log on and work at those player ports are solo L.O.G.I players. We're talking about people who don't have any clan affiliation, they just want to log on, they want to contribute, they want to do a bit, and they'll just go to these ports now because that's where they can show up and say, what can I do to help? And someone can point them in the right direction. We've completely lost the concept of old where that player could potentially save a front line. That in itself, I fear, is a relic of the past and something that we could be nostalgic about going forward.
So, but the number one reason I get the concerns about wanting to stretch out the L.O.G.I lines to make it harder to push. My main counterpoint towards that is a single factory producing shirts isn't enough to sustain a front line. So if we do have some L.O.G.I towns, which are like one factory, one refinery, somewhat close to each other, then that will create a place where people that want to deliver by trucks, especially new players that don't know necessarily what they're doing and don't know about the player ports yet, that will facilitate a place for them to go and a place for them to do what they've traditionally liked to do. At the moment, we do have refineries and we do have factories, but the main ones I normally deal with are the ones in Blemish and the refinery at the foundry in Wildwood. And there was actually a very large skill gap in getting mass resources over a land route to a factory town, something which a new player they just don't, and a lot of public L.O.G.I just don't want to do, because it's such an effort to transfer it all over there by land. And considering that the factories are often backwards from the refineries and they're so far away, you don't get situations where R1 truck drivers pick up a bunch of BMATs and go to the factory on the way to the front. Or you do, it's just not as common. So one of the really good suggestions I heard from the community was not necessarily putting the factory in the same town as the refinery, but rather putting in the same hex, somewhere where it's tactical, to make it sort of an important tactical spot, where you might even have a situation where one team owns a refinery and one team owns a factory, just so that it's somewhere close enough that those drivers can go on the way to the factory to supplement the supplies for the front, to sort of hold it out into the main freighter shipping hubs.
Can I add to that there? That while the idea about having a refinery in one region and a factory in another region is what Hannibal suggested, but with them both in the same region, as I think everybody could come together and say, the idea of having those in two different regions is fatally flawed with the queue system to get into those regions, and that in itself is preventing the gameplay loop and experience that I think everybody would react positively towards having.
So going back a bit, sorry, just to finish off a point I was saying, I believe from what I've understand, having the factory and refinery separate from a seaport or a depot for the frontline refinery towns will have the added-on effect that people won't use them for stockpiling. They'll only get used for, or nearly only, G-subs get made everywhere. You put a factory in the middle of nowhere, someone put G-subs in it. But for mostly, they will be used for frontline deliveries instead of people trying to stockpile near the front lines. So you would still have that situation where clans wouldn't want to use them for stockpiling because it'll be too difficult to use for stockpiling, and will still defer to the backline regions, the MPF towns, to mass stockpile and mass ship with freighters.
We sort of saw that currently in this war. Howell County with the Great Warden Dam. There were colonial logistics teams who made it their mission purely just to deliver basic materials because there was a factory in that region. And if the front line needed something, it could be made there.
However, it sounds good in principle, but those BMATs, factories churn through BMATs very, very quickly. It's a stopgap solution, but unless there's a refinery in the region sustaining factories and trying to sustain a front line, it's not the same. Like Public L.O.G.I will go through all those BMATs so quickly, it's not even funny. And then they don't have any BMATs and they can't use that factory anymore. And it's, as I was saying, the skill gap to actually supply a big enough logistics network to keep inter-region factories running is pretty insane. Even with all the resources I've got in my clan, we very rarely do it.
All right. Well, I do think we need
this even was something I saw in 83 as well, and I promise this is the last time I'll interject on this matter.
Mm-hmm.
But in War 83, as supplies were being brought from Speaking Woods to Lochmore, logistics players took an interest in using the factories at Jade Cove, and attempts were made several times to try and provide a private stockpile filled to the brim with basic materials. But you do not have enough freighter pilots to sustain the two factories there. You do not have the ability to feed those factories faster than they consume.
On the plus side, I think the next few points are very quick ones. So
yeah, this is one of our meteor points.
Right, if we do want to move on, yeah.
I'm in a roleplay, right? So I've just logged on, and I'm like, okay, I see that some new tech is unlocked, or we need some items in our reserve that we're short on. So I need to get some materials out of our stockpile. So I go to the seaport, and I get out a truck, and I'm like, I calculate how much stuff I need, and it's like I'm going to need 600 EMATs and 600 BMATs. I'm just estimating it. So I need 600 EMATs and 600 BMATs to make a full queue of some shell type at the MPF. So I have to pull the EMATs out. So you pull out 15 crates of EMATs, and then you right-click on the crates of EMATs in your truck. And then, because they're 20 per stack, they stay in your truck in stacks of 20. So now you have to try and, you want to consolidate those 15 stacks of 20 EMATs, because it comes in 20 per crate. You want to consolidate those into 3 stacks of 100. So you have to transfer each stack one at a time by holding shift and then left clicking, so 15 clicks to transfer all of it into the inventory of the seaport that you're in front of. Oh, some random guy goes, oh, free EMATs, and he takes your EMATs. Or So this can lead to misunderstandings. This is another one of those things where you don't want mechanics that cause conflict. So that can cause conflict. Doesn't happen very often, but does. If it doesn't happen, fine. You then collect the 300, put it in your inventory. Now you have to repeat the process. So it's sort of this clumsy, by accident mechanic that was never really designed, but that's how you play this game. Is you have to do this fumbling, shuffling your inventory around to create stacks of EMATs to take them to the MPF. So what we're suggesting as a solution to this is that when you uncrate the EMATs, either they automatically consolidate into stacks of 100, or we add in a button in the right-click interface, which would be near the pack button, and instead of it saying pack or unpack, you'd have a third option which says consolidate, and it would consolidate everything in your inventory into the most condensed version. So that's our suggestion for this one. I think that's about it. If anyone has anything to add.
I do.
Yeah, it's basically just the opposite of the split stack, isn't it?
Yeah, but that was the idea. Another suggestion that came up was a unpack as material option. So pull as material option. So having the ability to pull those resources, and when you pull them, they auto merge into one stack in your truck instead of coming out as 3 separate crates. That way, when people were dealing with like bringing one hauler trucks full of mats to build tanks, they don't need to worry about trying to get their truck all the way filled and trying to deal with juggling the last couple of slots of crates and filling the truck completely up. That being said, a different issue just occurred to my mind, and now that I think about it, didn't actually show up in any of our.
Are you talking about the factory one?
Yeah. So in terms of factories, an issue I really want to put out there because I've had so many misunderstandings with it. When you make a queue in the factory, it pulls all of the resources out of the quick inventory of the factory before your truck. So for a lot of new logistics players, they just see their materials they put in the factory suddenly disappearing. And I've had so many complaints from new players, so many misunderstandings that could have been avoided if they drew from the truck first. Okay, sorry about that. That was my one tangent.
Yeah, I just want to speak to that. So what often happens is you go to the factories, you put on 5 or 6 full orders of stuff. So you've got small arms, advanced, utility, medical, and like supplies. So you put on your full orders. Now you drive back to the seaport, you get a full truck of BMATs. So you got 1,500 BMATs. You drive back to the factory, and you want to put on some more orders. But first you have to pick up the orders that are already there waiting for you. In order to pick up an order, you must remove 4 stacks of BMATs out of your truck. So you transfer 4 stacks of BMATs into the factory, then you collect your order, then you go to put an order on, and when you go to put it, but before you get to put it on, someone else has seen these free BMATs that have just appeared in the factory, and they instantly steal them. So this is a recurring...
No, not even Alabastor. What happens is people have BMATs in their truck, and they set queues, and it auto-takes them.
Yeah,
most of the time players
steal them. It's an accident. Yeah. They're accidentally stealing them, but sometimes people just take it on purpose. But yeah,
that's true. But we can't do anything about those people.
Well, it would be good if the devs were aware of it, and then they might be able to think about a solution to it. But
that is true.
I think we've covered this point, and we can move on to the next one, if I may.
Yep. Sorry about that.
Yeah, happy
tangent.
Go.
So the point 8, of course, is that we cannot process an entire freighter's worth of salvage into the basic material queue. I'd like to start by pointing out that this is something where we used to have the ability to put 25,000 scrap into the basic material refinery queue, and it was removed as part of a fix to the eternal refinery queue exploit, something that was considered important to resolve as it created a mechanic that many believed was necessary to work the factories, but it was anything but intuitive in how you actually achieved it. So what we have now is the cap, 20,000 basic materials. We're 5 short of an entire freighter load. So
10,000, 20,000 scrap.
Yes, 20,000 scrap, and there's 25,000 in a freighter. We're 5,000 short. The cap that now exists has been troublesome in that it's chained people to the refinery to empty it out every hour and a half if they actually want to try and keep feeding their basic material queue. But what has sort of moved this up to being a flagstone issue is the player scrap ports, where more and more players are now bringing back 25,000 scrap to a logistics town seaport. The trouble that in itself causes is a different subject about the loop of the freighter driver's gameplay experience, which is broken by having to acquire a flatbed. Hopefully there'll be a flatbed there for them. But let us assume that the player has a flatbed, and let us assume that the player is willing to deal with the changing of vehicles. The full freighter that's brought, as I said, has only been commonplace with the player's seaports, and that's purely because players have adopted the specific logistics rules, since doing everything is not just inefficient but frustrating, and honestly, a very quick way for a player to burn out. We've mentioned this earlier, in fact. The inability to place the entire freighter's content into the basic materials queue has been a point of discontent for many, and it's certainly the greatest issue when it comes to players who are looking to specialize into the factory production line worker, because they're hamstrung by the basic materials that they have readily available. We see leg room being added in places. In the next update, seaports will have larger stockpiles of freighters. So we've seen that a greater number of freighters can be stored in a seaport. What many logistics players feel when they see that there is that the basic material scrap queue is an area where we could have some legroom added as well. It feels that this cap was sensible when players were very inefficient and not embracing specific rules. But now with players intentionally logging in just to operate cranes at player ports, this cap rubs abrasively almost against those trying to take advantage of the opportunities that the economies of scale have brought us.
Yeah, I'm just going to add my note on that one really quickly. Something that we were sent when we got this whole L.O.G.I Union Discord before that I never saw was that sometime in the past, once a scarcity update came in, we had the ability to refine more than 60,000 scrap for BMATs. So we had the ability to go over 10k BMATs. At some point, it was decided to go lower and to bring it down to 10k. And I'm kind of curious why we can't have that back now that we have much larger supply lines and much larger players getting involved in this.
My sort of point to add to this is my sort of theme, if people go back to think back to my opening argument, is my theme is making sure that players only have to do what they want to do. And we have a lot of people that like to get scrap from a field and drive back and forward, but the process of them having to stop driving back and forward and then releasing it over time, it drags on them. A lot of our drivers don't like having to switch containers and then get the BMATs and then put them in the seaport. So this is just one of those cases where you can make things smooth and reduce burnout by segmenting up the tasks.
I think we can move on to the next point unless anyone has anything else to contribute.
I agree.
No, sounds good.
This is to do with crate limits within reserve stockpiles, but also within public stockpiles as well, which semi ties back to the backhauling issues and issues I said with the backhauling, in that stockpiles fill up. Like, it's not easy to get rid of the containers, and you got this container problem, but then you look in the back lines, and the back lines don't have enough containers, or they don't have enough freighters, and people are like, why can't we just crate them up into crates for free and ship them back? Which ties in, like I said, ties into the previous issue. And this issue was important enough for our freighter L.O.G.I in particular, but it actually showed up somewhat considered twice on our list. In particular, this one is specifically to do with stockpile overflows and facilitating ways to stop for stockpile overflows We know that the devs in the dev branch have increased the limit for freighters. We want to see the limits for shipping containers, resource containers, generally increased a lot as well, because they also overflow. There has been suggestions of implementing a regiment stockpile system for certain regiments, so that they can keep all their things more closer together. The idea about that each regiment can have one regiment stockpile in a seaport that's always there. It'll still go to public after 50 hours if no one touches it, but it will still remain there and have that central places, so more smaller clans don't have to have the barrier of entry of setting up a code system.
I think the other key thing about this point here, and this will be quick, is that this also primarily relates to the limit of 300 BMATs, as well as the limit for artillery shells, in that those are two items that are always in heavy need and always max out in stockpiles, to the point where you have a person in a clan who is just dedicated all 5 of his reserve stockpile slots to holding artillery crates and the like.
I mentioned earlier that you can only have 5 stockpiles entered in, but are not your own stockpiles. And so the biggest sort of public incident on the colonial side of this was D3C made 20 public stockpiles filled with artillery shells, and no one could access all of them at once. And so it was an absolute mess, and a bunch of them ended up going out into public as well, because we just couldn't access them all. And it's a big mess. We need a way to cancel, be able to forget stockpiles. All that number needs to be increased so people can access more stockpiles, or preferably both. Or just increase the limit for things like artillery shells.
Yeah, I think that's the easiest solution, is just upping the upper limits for artillery shells and stuff like that. Because if clans are already using all 5 regiments just to hold their artillery, there should be either more ability to hold more of those items, and this goes for BMATs too, or just increase the amount that you get per crate, so you need less crates total, and this is mostly related to artillery.
To add on to the crates element there, I don't think there is many logistics players who would argue that the cost of EMATs to produce a crate of 120 millimeters is currently excessive. If you double the cost of the EMATs and you increase the number of shells, I don't think anyone would be upset.
I would love that.
I'm pretty sure the small amount of shells is there on purpose to limit the ease of delivery.
I think base builders would disagree with you and would not like it if you increase the number of shells per crate.
That's fair, but I think we've also covered this point now. We can move on to the next one, yes?
Oh, no.
Go ahead then.
I think I may have been misunderstood. My apologies. What I was saying was that if you increase the number of shells, I don't think anyone would disagree with the increase in the EMAT cost of the shells as well. The price of a crate of 120 millimeters is I believe, someone might be able to give me the number, 20 EMATs for a crate. It's cheap enough that if you doubled the EMAT cost and you doubled the amount of shells in the crate, I think you would appease both the artillery players and the logistics players.
Yeah, it's currently cheap enough that it's controversial to put them in the MPF.
Yeah, as much as I want to see that increase, I don't think the devs will let us get away with having 10 RD shell crates per it. I think more specifically, if they're going to stay at 5 per crate, like the devs can make some room as far as giving us more space in the stockpiles. Because Jeffrey, I don't know if you've ever had to juggle stockpiles before or just managing one, but it's not an unheard of thing that most clans have to have 10 to 12 regiment stockpiles just to manage
especially for artillery. Yeah,
artillery in particular, I can absolutely see, and certainly for the others as well. I have not had the displeasure of having to manage stockpiles specifically for that reason. It's funny because I see people go hardcore all the time, but just for frame of reference, I kind of trend more casual, particularly these days as I get more busy. But yeah, carry on.
So I think that pretty much covers it. Any more debate about artillery, and we're going to need an artillery union. So I think we can move on to the next point.
You just keep on syndicating from further and further. I'm all for it.
Hey, solidarity forever. On that, moving on, I think that next point is 10, which is snowstorms, correct?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So, snowstorms. Particularly the issue here lies with early war snowstorms. I think we've had a couple of wars now recently where snowstorms have hit in the backline regions on day one, and it just completely shuts down logistics and the flow from the front. And there's a couple of reasons that kind of go into that. First off, the big thing here is there's just not enough tools out and available to deal with winter storms. And we've kind of talked about various fixes and stuff like this. But yeah, there's just not enough resources and tools and like actual sources for us to work with at the moment. Like there's not enough BMATs and diesel in the flow of the economy to supply bonfires. For logistics players in particular, there's a big risk of your vehicle getting frozen and not having any tools to deal with that. And this is especially evident with freighters. If your freighter gets frozen either because you disconnected and you're in the middle of the water, that freighter is stuck out there in the water until the snowstorm stops, essentially, and it's just stranded. And a couple of solutions we had, and I think number one here that we kind of agreed on is that logistics players kind of need more tools to help deal with snowstorms and the like. We all kind of agree that weather is interesting to deal with in Foxhole, and it's cool to plan around it, but there's just a lot of gripes that come with not having any means to deal with it. I know the first suggestion we've kind of pitched here is for blowtorches and the like, so that you can thaw out vehicles without having to build a bonfire, something that was smaller to kind of handle and move around, but doesn't necessarily stop yourself from freezing. We've also discussed how you could potentially leave vehicles on to prevent them from freezing, but while still consuming diesel and fuel. And then how certain buildings should emit heat, such as mines and the like, so that things around them don't freeze. And then with regards to early snowstorms themselves, if we could set like a timer to potentially not have early snowstorms within at least the early or the backline logistics regions for the first couple days of the war, so that things can kind of get set up and then snowstorms can come in, that would be a good system to fix it as well. Otherwise, if there was some form of seasons within Foxhole, so that we kind of had a rough guess as to when things would start to pick up with regards to snowstorms, that could allow logistics players to start to preemptively expect when we would need to develop more tools for snowstorms. And I feel like that covers a lot of what we have kind of gone over with regards to snowstorms. Would anyone else like to contribute on that point?
I would like to contribute a very, very, very big pain point for freighter L.O.G.I during freezing. A lot of players often disconnect when crossing a border, and if it's freezing, the freighters freeze and they disconnect, and it causes several things. One thing, that player can never get their freighter back, which could be filled with supplies, a lot of supplies, because there's no way to unfreeze the freighter once it gets frozen in the middle of the river.
And we're talking specifically here about when the water isn't frozen, but the freighter is.
Yes. Secondly, in certain areas along the map, the freighters freeze in such a way that the L.O.G.I routes get blocked. And it's very difficult to remove a freighter because you need at least 3 or 4 people with stickies because of the weapon locks that gets caused from attacking the friendly vehicle. And so the combination of these two means even when it's not ice, when it hits the L.O.G.I routes, you get lots of frustration. It's actually enough for people to not want to do freighter L.O.G.I when this happens, and completely turns them off the game. We have a lot of talk in this section. As Knight mentioned, with winter on day one, a lot of L.O.G.I players are against it because they feel they don't have enough equipment around to deal with it. That being said, if we were to implement new features to help deal with these new equipment, to help deal with these issues, it might not be as bad, but probably still pretty unpopular having winter on day one, just because factions feel like they're getting targeted, and it's not necessarily a good feeling. I would like to, if anyone can interrupt me here, but I would like to comprehensively go over some of the suggestions for how to unfreeze vehicles, especially freighters, but also vehicles in general.
This is another one of those areas where it would be helpful to communicate with the devs what exactly helps determine winter storms appearing and such like that, because it's hard to track down information of what's been said about them, and having a better understanding of how weather works can help deal with the problems associated with it too.
Is there anything
Yes, if we
anyone
could have
else?
a certain degree of predictability, if we could have seasons perhaps. We already count the days of the year in game using the map. It tells you how many days in. And in times past, when we had cross-faction voice chat, we would even have ceasefires at Christmas. So the potential for seasons, which would have the ominous effect of letting you know in advance, now's the time for the snowstorms, would at least give some anticipatory preparation ability to players.
Yes, it would increase engagement a fair bit around the weather system, because it is interesting. It is interesting to adapt to the challenges that come with it.
I wanted to more comprehensively go over some of the suggestions, because the suggestions here are quite interesting. Knight mentioned a blowtorch, which is the idea that you have this second slot equipable consumable item, which you could make in the factory. Someone even suggested that you could use diesel to make these things and then ship them up to the front lines, and you can use them as a single-use item to unfreeze a vehicle. Another suggestion was expanding on it and just having torches, which are exactly the same thing, but they also generate local heat and could be used to signal people in the darkness. And they kind of come into the category of having a consumable item that can unfreeze a vehicle, but also probably important to have a second slot so people can use it on motorboats or unfreezing freighters. The second one is what's being called as was it called a space heater? Is what people have been calling it?
Yeah.
So having this item, it might be expensive, but this big chunky item, it might be an item you have to hold on your shoulders, I don't know. But you put it in a vehicle and that vehicle cannot freeze. Or you put it in a freeze vehicle and it unfreezes that vehicle. So for L.O.G.I tracks, it gives this idea that you can sacrifice the concept. You sacrifice a slot to keep your vehicle from freezing. And of course, tell me if I'm wrong, but I believe every vehicle in the game has at least one slot.
Yes.
Yes.
Even bicycles have a slot where you can put a heater on. It'll be cool to put a heater on your.
Carry items other than ammo, like mortar.
That can easily be changed though. Put an exception for the space heater.
The bicycle does freeze.
Yeah, but if you put a heater on it in this quick inventory, it won't freeze. How cool would that be?
I do love the imagery of someone
Not very
cycling
cool.
along with
It's not
an
frozen.
enormous radiator stuck to the back of their bicycle.
Alright, your last point?
But the last one was specifically for freighters, was putting a heat source on barges. That way barges, because at the moment barges can't, barge partisans can't operate in winter because they all freeze on the barge. They need to have workarounds like hosting in a truck on a barge. It's a bit painful. Putting a native heat source on the barge would mean people can still run around and do piracy during winter, but it would also mean that they could park their barge next to a freighter and unfreeze the freighter, and then winch the freighter and move it out of the way, all without having to worry about getting any specific equipment for it.
That's my favourite one. I think that's a really good idea. Having some item that you make it's a utility item. It costs some BMATs and some diesel at the factory. It's expendable. You use it once, and it gives you like just a quick. It's like a fire, but a one-time use, and it's quite expensive. And you can defrost something in the water with it.
Yeah, that's my favourite as well. But the other ones have merit as well, I think.
There's lots of options we've discussed.
Yes, I was quite passionate about the fire pit on a stick, but I think we can move on now.
I like the fire pit on a stick.
Is that a torch?
Ahead,
Isn't that literally just a torch?
It's a torch, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you, but I preferred my way.
Okay.
We'll be prepared for the next Dead Harvest event. We'll have torches. We'll make an angry mob. It'll be
awesome.
Great. Also, protest tools? No, I'm just joking.
Next topic
is
unstucks. I believe Bazlow is going to be presenting this one.
Yes, this is the unstuck command. You only get 3 goes at the unstuck command each war. Every player gets 3 unstuck runs. The unstuck command, of course, was a solution to replace moderators freeing vehicles up. The challenge here is that the feature, even when it was introduced, was not quite as satisfying or as effective as what existed previously. Moderators would drop your freighter back in the water, and some were practical. The unstuck command is a bit of a roll of a dice. You might go further inland, you might go back to sea, or you might do nothing at all. The necessity for this feature can often be attributed to the terrible habit of freighters interacting with land at the edge of the sea or the river and never moving again. It's particularly noticeable in regions with rivers, like Stone Cradle. The greater issue is that this is a feature created for a smaller world with shorter wars. We have more spots than ever to trap vehicles. They exist, and many of us have compiled lists of them. For us, having to pass through these areas that could trap us multiple times per war, we're sadly reaching a point where players are frustrated, they've got their freighter stuck, they've used their 3 unstucks, and the war will not be over for another 10 to 15 days. In some cases, players will not drive a freighter again for the duration of the war out of fear of being trapped. They will have their 3 incidents, and that is the metric that they will use to know when it is time to stop doing freighter runs. That in itself is a problem, as the number of players prepared to drive a freighter is not as infinite as those willing to deploy to the front. Anyone want to chip in?
Well, I guess I'll ask, what do you think the number should be raised to? Just spitballing.
Can I say the number?
Yeah.
I believe a really nice number would be the same as for the MPF queues releasing to public, the same as your refinery queue releasing to public, your stockpile release to public. Every 50 hours is when those things go. I think it's 48 hours or 50 hours. So just make it the same as that. Every 50 hours we get a free unstuck command added to our existing amount. And maybe we have a maximum of 3 at any one time.
Yeah, we set to 3 or something like that. Be good.
Yeah, I definitely agree. Like if it was a resetting mechanism, then it would just scale perfectly with war length, and you wouldn't need to be worried about the fact that wars go a lot longer than they did before.
All right, and if we were going to increase the cap, I think like 5, 6 would be a good number, and you just would gradually recharge back up to that number.
Three's probably still fine if we're resetting it every 50 hours.
I mean, yeah, whatever works, honestly. If 3's good, 3's good.
Because it was limited on purpose to avoid potential situations with grieving.
I've personally never heard of any way to exploit it, of exploiting unstucks.
I have seen,
but I don't know.
Enemy tanks teleport inside bases before. Very, very, very rarely. I don't know if it has anything to do with unstacks, but I don't know. I don't know, so I get their concern.
You'd be rolling the dice on where your tank would end up, so I don't think it would really be abused, honestly.
It could be, but because of the resetting, they won't have a situation, and still having the cap of 3, they won't have a situation where one account could spam it 10 times in a row, and then get a freighter 40 meters inland without significant effort.
Can I just add a couple more things in here that I'm pretty sure everyone's going to agree with? When they did the entrenched update, they updated the tactical camera for all the vehicles in the game. The camera for the naval vessels, specifically the freighter, is bugged, and the problem we used to have with corner aiming for everyone is now just for freighter drivers. You have this new phenomenon called down aiming, and you have to rotate your camera facing the wrong way, and you have to steer in reverse and drive your freighter down the screen to get the full camera. So that's one that's bad. The second one is every ladder in the game is bugged. When you climb up a ladder, you teleport to the top of it, and then you have to climb, then you teleport back to the bottom again, and this is just, it's a weird bug. L.O.G.I players experience it more than anyone, because we always have to swim back to the ladder when we get out of our boats at the seaports. One more issue is the cranes at the seaport. When someone brings in their truck and you're inside the crane at the seaport, they can often block the entrance point for the crane and you can't get out. So it pretty much happens to most L.O.G.I players who run the cranes at the seaport almost every day. They're like, please, can you move out of the way? I can't get out of the crane. And it's just having to say that all the time.
Yes, at least once a day, someone's screaming, door stuck.
As someone that drives a freighter a lot, I don't particularly mind the restricted camera, just because I'm so used to it, but I understand that it confuses a lot of players and makes them drive the wrong direction. But the crane stuck there, getting stuck in the crane is probably the most critical one there, because I have actually been griefed personally by people purposely parking in trucks to block me. And it's not a good experience.
Just a final point that I wanted to raise as well, just as a very, very top level thing, really, is basically about what draws people to logistics. So as has been mentioned a couple of times during the session, there's been a survey that's been done through L.O.G.I, and we've had a good number of 380, 390 people responding to this one. One of the questions that was asked is, what aspects of logistics draw you to that style of play? And two of the responses kind of really resonated with me, and one of them was, I enjoy supporting the common good, and that was the most popular answer with 313 responses. And the second most popular was, I enjoy influencing a player-driven economy, and that was with 250 responses. And the only reason that I bring that up is because it speaks a lot about the kinds of people that like to play logistics, and I'm talking primarily like logistics mains, people that do logistics as their core gameplay, instead of, say, frontliners that occasionally dip in when something is needed. So these are the kinds of people that enjoy playing support characters. They like optimization puzzles. These are probably the kinds of people that are playing Factorio or games of that sort. And really, I just wanted to say that I'd really look for game mechanics and developments that kind of facilitate those mentalities and those gameplay fantasies. And I think you see a lot of that kind of thing with the player-developed ports that we've seen through both factions over the last couple of wars, where they are driven by players that are looking at the current systems and taking that puzzle resolution, like that optimization drive, to the existing mechanics. And although the ports work, there are so many ways that mechanically they could work better, if the game was designed around that style of play. So I know there isn't really a specific actionable point that I'm raising here, but I just wanted to say that just so it was out there, really.
For any devs that are watching this or listening in live, even implementing a couple of the issues we've suggested today would go a long way to bringing trust into the community. We know that not all of these issues can be fixed. We know development cycles are complicated, but even some small feedback on the issues that we presented would be very much appreciated.
And we would love to continue working with you and foster discussion further if possible. We want to help you guys achieve your vision.
And, with that, I think we're going to close out this roundtable. I'd really like to thank each and every one of these participants, these representatives from the L.O.G.I Union and the L.O.G.I Union itself, for taking the time, not just with these 2 hours, but also just in general, taking the time to really organize and really put into a neat, digestible thing all these raw emotions, all these frustrations, and all these back and forths that we see on the subreddit and all the various Discord chats and messages that it can get pretty ugly sometimes. But I think, in my opinion, this is about as clean and clear cut as it's gonna get in terms of straight feedback, particularly considering how all these people here are representatives and voted on, and a lot of deliberation beforehand coming into here. And hey, even then, it's still a lot. So it's a testament, really, to this beautiful thing that we have here called Foxhole, as messy as it is. So with that, we will, links down below for the letter, as well as the website and other sources regarding that. So again, thank you. And for the PressCorps, I'm Jeffrey Jennings. Good night and good fight.
The PressCorps is a non-profit creative collective of artists, reporters, and players from the MMO video game Foxhole by Siege Camp. Our mission is to engross our audience in and amplify the stories of this unique war ecosystem. The PressCorps was founded in early 2018 by former PlanetSide 2 Radio Free Oraxis host Captain in Arms. It is a separate community entity and is in no way representative of Siege Camp. For more information, visit the PressCorps Discord through the link below.